Hello, this is Malachi Bishop with the Rehab Counseling Program at the University of Kentucky. And this is RC-650, Rehab Counseling Theories and Techniques. Today we're going to be talking about Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis was born in 1913, and he's another American-born psychiatrist we'll be talking about. Psychologist, actually, that we'll be talking about today. I'm going to start, as usual, with a little discussion about Albert Ellis himself and his life. Albert Ellis is, like a lot of the people we've been talking about, was a unique individual and something of a strong character. And I think, like we talked about Fritz Perls' sort of unique approach to Gestalt therapy, I don't think anybody really did or could have done REBT counseling quite like Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis was born, as I said, in 1913 in Pittsburgh, but he moved to New York at the age of 4 and lived in New York the rest of his life. He died just very recently in 2007. He was 93 years old. He was the oldest of 3 children. So another oldest brother, 2 younger siblings, a boy and a girl, a brother and sister, within 4 years of his age. And Ellis's father was a businessman who traveled quite a bit. He's described as not too affectionate, not frequently affectionate with his children, often away from home on business trips, especially during their early childhood. And Ellis's mother was described as emotionally distant, and Ellis described his mother as a self-absorbed woman with a bipolar disorder affect. So that sort of from mania to depression sort of range, and he described his mother that way. She, again, his words, she ranged from a bustling chatterbox who never listened to a mother who was often sleeping. When he left, he and his brothers and sisters would leave for school and frequently not home when he returned. So you get this sense of Albert Ellis having to become, and he did indeed become, or was, a very independent young man. He independent and responsible. He took on the responsibility of caring for his younger brother and sister during the Depression, which would have been in the late 20s, early 30s. All 3 children had to seek work to assist the family. Albert was a frail child and had a number of health problems. He was actually hospitalized several times, beginning at age 5, and several times between the ages of 5 and 8, one time for almost a full year. His parents apparently rarely came to visit him or didn't give him a lot of emotional support during these years. So early experiences that resulted in or affected him in such a way that he became highly independent and responsible young man. He earned his business degree from City University in New York and had a brief career in business, and then he had a career as a writer, where he found that he had more talent for nonfiction than for fiction writing, and he enjoyed nonfiction writing. He started to write about the field of human sexuality, and he developed expertise in this area in the 40s, and there were not a lot of experts in this area writing and talking about human sexuality. So he developed expertise that got him attention and exposure, and he began to counsel people in this area, and he his work in counseling led him to seek a career in clinical psychology. So in 1942, he began his PhD in clinical psychology at Columbia University and was trained in the psychoanalytic tradition. And he completed his doctorate 5 years later in 1947 and began the supervision and analysis process. As I said when we were talking about psychoanalysis, in order to become a psychoanalyst, one has to be analyzed by a psychoanalyst. So he went through that process and started to practice as an analyst, psychoanalyst. Did so for several years, but he was becoming and eventually became disillusioned with psychoanalysis. It wasn't working for him, and he particularly felt that it was a passive and inefficient and ineffective approach. And when you see and read Albert Ellis, you can see that he was a person who was energetic and participatory and efficient, and you can sort of understand why he would have a problem with the passivity and inefficiency of psychoanalysis. So he took a couple years and studied hundreds of other methods. So he took a couple years to really do some research and reading, and tried to find an approach that was more his style and that made more sense to him. And as a result of this research, he developed what he initially called rational therapy, and first started talking and writing about that in 1955. The name changed to rational emotive therapy in 1961. So for about 30 years, this theory was known as RET, but in 1993, he added the B, the behavior. So changed the name to Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy in 1993, and that's what we know it as today. And Adler said, really, this reflected not a change in the theory itself. The idea was consistent throughout. He identified a number of influences in the development of REBT. He was particularly influenced by the Stoic philosophers and the idea of rationality and the ideas of the Stoic philosophers. He was influenced by behavior theory and therapy, and he was also highly influenced by the theory of Alfred Adler. And he actually said several times that credited Adler with the idea that people's behavior stems from their ideas, and called Adler the modern psychotherapist who was the main precursor of REBT. So another therapist, highly influenced by Alfred Adler's ideas, but he certainly took a unique approach and was influenced by several other systems of thinking and theories, and put together what we know today as REBT. He founded the Institute for RET in 1959, and the Institute continues today. He was involved with the Institute until just a few years ago, and he died, as I said, in 2007 at the age of 93. Albert Ellis said, "The best years of your life are the ones in which you decide that your problems are your own. You do not blame them on your mother, the ecology, or the president. You realize that you control your own destiny. People and things do not upset us, rather we upset ourselves by believing that they can upset us." That's sort of a nutshell of what we're talking about with REBT. And Albert Ellis was a fairly prolific writer, wrote several books, many books, and many articles. He wrote a lot of books with interesting titles, but some of the earlier books, for example, included The Guide to Rational Living, How to Live with a Neurotic, The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Manhunting, and How to Keep People from Pushing Your Buttons, some of the earlier books that he wrote. I told you that the name has changed over the years, since 1955 when he first started talking about rational therapy, and as he said, the changes in the name reflect a clarification and inclusion of elements that have always been present in the theory, not a basic philosophical or practical change. So as I said, the ideas were consistent, the name changes were just clarification and inclusion of elements that were already there. So moving into the key ideas for REBT. First of all, REBT is an active directive. So as an REBT counselor, we are active and directive, and as a client, you are active and participating in the counseling process. It is a multimodal therapy, and that's a term that we will start to hear again and again. In the theories we talk about in the future, multimodal meaning including cognitive, emotional, behavioral techniques. So we're operating with and on different modes of behaving, thinking, and feeling. So key concept number one, the duality of human nature, the idea that there are two parts to our nature. And the principle is that people are born with the potential for rational as well as irrational thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We have the potential for both. We are, on the one hand, we are goal-oriented, and we have the innate tendency, so that within us we have this tendency for self-preservation, happiness, communion, self-actualization. Sounds a lot like Carl Rogers. Okay, but on the other side, we also have this inborn and innate tendency towards self-destruction, perfectionism, avoiding thought, procrastinating, avoiding growth. So we have this dual nature. We have the potential for rational as well as irrational. So this idea of competing nature, the key concept number two, REBT says that it is these irrational beliefs, dogmatic musts, and imperative demands about events, rather than the events themselves. It's the way we believe about the events. It's our demands and beliefs about the events, rather than the events themselves, that cause the resulting self-defeating feelings, dysfunctional behaviors that get us into problems, that keep us from reaching our goals. Okay, critical idea from this REBT perspective. Third key concept is this idea of holism that we've talked about before. REBT views the basic human processes of thinking, feeling, or emoting, and behaving as interrelated and generally simultaneous, so that, for example, if you are thinking negatively, then you tend to feel badly, and when you feel badly, you tend to think negative thoughts, act compulsively or avoidantly if you're feeling anxious, and when you act compulsively, you tend to think and feel negatively. So we have this cycle. Basically, these things are interrelated. Our thinking, our feeling, and our behaving are interrelated and happening at the same time. Because of this, the most effective approach to therapy and the most elegant method of therapy, as Ellis called it, will be one which engages the client on all three levels. So because all of this is happening at the same time, is all interrelated, then the most effective counseling response will be to deal with the person, to work with the person on the way that they are thinking, the way that they are feeling, and the way that they are behaving. So rational, emotive behavior therapy is a multimodal counseling approach where we work with people in all of those areas. And this is probably the most important key idea, this ABC model that we're going to talk about. ABC model of response to change. A couple of ideas before we get into the ABCs. First of all, Ellis believed that people are goal-oriented. And again, this idea of universal and individual goals. So he said that we have overriding fundamental goal to survive, to be relatively free from pain, and to be reasonably satisfied or content. We have, within that overriding goal, we have sub-goals, or primary goals. And these include being happy with ourselves, being happy alone, being happy with others, including intimate relationships and broader social relationships. Being happy in terms of our educational, vocational, economic, and recreational activities. So being happy in terms of what we're doing, how we're spending our time. And in the course of pursuing our goals, in the course of trying to be free from pain, relatively satisfied, happy, and engaging in our school and our work and our recreational activities, sometimes things come up that challenge us. So in the course of pursuing these goals, people experience adversity or events which thwart us in our attempts to reach our goals. And these adversities, these challenges are identified in this ABC model as the activating event, the thing which keeps us from reaching our goal. So something happens that stops us from reaching our goal, and the B represents the beliefs or attitudes, rational and irrational, that we have regarding the activating event. And then C connotes the emotional or behavioral consequences or reaction of the individual to A as a result of holding particular beliefs at B. But how this is a little different from people before they sort of understand this model is that people tend to think that the emotional and behavioral consequences, how we respond to an event, is inherent in the event itself. And what Alice is saying here, that's a little bit different, is that it's not the event that causes us to have our emotional and cognitive reactions. It is actually our beliefs about the event. And different people, different experiences will have different beliefs. And the other key point is that we can become aware of our beliefs and we can change our beliefs. People can respond to the activating event, the things that happen to us that keep us from reaching our goals, with irrational or rational beliefs. Rational beliefs are beliefs that are flexible and are expressed as preferences, hopes, and wishes. For example, if the person loses their job, the person might respond with a statement like, "I wish I had not lost my job, but I did. And it's unfortunate, but I can certainly continue with my life and find happiness in another position, so I can get another job." And that would be an example of a rational belief, flexible. It's too bad. It's going to be uncomfortable for a while. I'm going to have to find a new job, but I can do that, and I can be happy with my life when I find my new job. We can also respond with irrational beliefs, and these are characterized by inflexibility, overgeneralizations, and absolutist musts, shoulds, and oughts. So in example, in this situation, the person who lost their job might say, "I should never have lost my job. It is awful that I lost my job, and my being let go proves that I am a worthless person." You might add things like, "My life will never be good again," or "I'll never find a job that was as good as this job." So those sorts of overgeneralizations, inflexibility, never and always, and things like that. So same situation, two different people respond to it two different ways, one rational and irrational. Over the course of his career, Ellis examined and wrote extensively about the commonly held and basic irrational beliefs. And at one point he suggested 11 specific irrational beliefs. Came up with a list. I'm not going to go through the 11 and sometimes longer lists of irrational beliefs, because they can be basically narrowed down into three types of beliefs. Beliefs about the self, about others, and about the world. So we're going to look at the irrational beliefs in terms of those three areas. So irrational beliefs about the self would include things like, I absolutely must at practically all times be successful and demonstrate competency in my endeavors and win the approval of virtually all the significant people in my life. So you can see there's some absolutist thinking there. I have to be successful, I have to be competent, I have to be liked and approved of by everybody in my life. I absolutely must at all times. So these sorts of beliefs, if you held them, you're going to have a life of disappointment, right? Because we are not always going to be successful. We're not always going to be competent. So we're going to run into problems if we have a belief like this. So such beliefs might lead to things like anxiety, depression, shame, guilt, and you might see the response in behaviors like avoidance and withdrawal. That idea we've talked about before of if I'm not going to succeed, then I'm not going to try. Also addictive behavior as a response, avoidance and withdrawal response. You might see that sort of behavior. Irrational beliefs about others would include, for example, demands that other people must practically always treat me considerately, kindly, fairly, and lovingly, and if they don't, then it is awful and they are no good and deserve no joy in their lives. Okay, again, if this is the expectation that you have, then you're probably going to be let down sometimes. And when those expectations are not met, you might experience anger, even rage. You might express passive aggressiveness, resentment, and you might see behaviors such as fighting and violence. And then irrational beliefs about the world, demands about the world and your living conditions. So you might say, for example, I need and must have the things that I want. What I want, I need. Conditions under which I live must be comfortable, pleasurable, and rewarding. If they're not, I can't stand it, and it is terrible. And again, there are feelings and behaviors associated with that sort of belief, rage, self-pity, withdrawal, procrastination, addiction, and that sort of behavior.